Welcome to an episode of the On the Water podcast. I'm Kevin Blinkoff. I'm here with
Jimmy Fee.
And our guest today is Micah Dean from the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. Micah's here to talk to us about striped bass and some of the research they're doing on striped bass release mortality. But before we jump into that, I just want to say welcome, Micah.
Thank you, Kevin.
Glad you could make it down here to Cape Cod to record with us. And let's get started by just tell everybody a little bit about yourself, about how you ended up at the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries.
I've been there for 22 years now, but really I'm just a kid that grew up next to a pond who would ride his bike and go fishing enough time that I found out that I could actually have a job in this space. And it was like my 10-year-old self would be so excited about what I get to do for a job day in and day out.
Where were you? Where did you grow up when you were 10 years old and fishing in the pond?
Hudson, Massachusetts, so like right in the middle of the state. But from there, I went to school in Vermont and fished Lake Champlain and Green Mountains. And then from there, I went to another school in central New York, the Finger Lakes, Lake Ontario. And I thought, I was being trained to be a freshwater biologist. That's where my history was. But when I graduated from grad school, first real job that came available was at the coast. And I haven't looked back. It's been like awesome ever since.
Awesome. And so now that you're on the coast and doing saltwater fisheries management, do you do a lot of saltwater fishing?
I do. From the day I moved out, I took my canoe, which I had, put it in the ocean, and I caught 20 striped bass that day. And I was like, this is the place to be. And so, yeah, I've upgraded to a little bit bigger boat, and I've got 3 kids, and they all like to go fishing, and it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
So at the Division of Marine Fisheries, responsible for saltwater fishery management in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts waters, what kind of projects have you worked on? What's your career been like there?
My responsibilities there is I do research and stock assessments. So stock assessments are like the mathematical models to figure out how much fish is too much to be taken out for population to be sustainable. So I do that for the small pelagic forage fish species like menhaden and Atlantic herring. But then I do research on questions that would benefit any of our fisheries management or other stock assessments. So I've done a lot of work on groundfish species like Atlantic cod and haddock, but more recently we've been doing a lot of research on striped bass. We've recognized that there are a few fish that are more important to Massachusetts than striped bass.
Right, striped bass, obviously, very important fish along the East Coast. And Massachusetts, I think, even though it's a fishery that striped bass are, spread along the coast, Massachusetts has really taken a lead in some of the research and studying striped bass in a way that'll benefit the entire coast.
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility there. I mean, Massachusetts is really like the summer foraging ground for much of the Atlantic coast population. And so I think it's something like 2/3 of striped bass recreational releases come from New England. More come from Massachusetts than any other state. It's like 3 times the next closest state of Maryland. So, it makes sense for us to be sort of the place that's doing a lot of the research on this fishery, and particularly recreational and release mortality.
And the current research, or I guess let's start with any striped bass research you've been involved with in Massachusetts. What are some of the projects you've done and bring us kind of up to where we are currently?
Yeah, so when I first started working with striped bass, probably I would say 15 years ago, we were doing some conventional tagging experiments. You catch them and you have that tagging gun, puts a little spaghetti plastic strip in there, and you rely on anglers catching that fish again and then reporting and calling the number on the tag. And you can learn a lot from that, but you're sort of reliant on putting out massive amounts of numbers so that you can have it recaptured and somebody be moved enough to call it in.
Any idea on the percentage of tagged fish versus recaptures?
Off the top of my head, I don't really remember, but in some of them, they're as high as 25% recapture rate, which is pretty for a conventional mark and recapture of any fish species. That's pretty high. I think that's telling that these fish are caught many times, and this is all the more important to treat them well. But we have sort of established ourselves as early leaders in what's called acoustic telemetry, so electronic tagging. And we do a lot of that now on a variety of species, but we've done a bunch of projects, acoustic telemetry on striped bass. So it allows you to catch You catch a fish and you put this electronic tag on them. You either surgically implant or like just quickly attach it on the outside, and then you let it go. Let it, live its natural life. And then we put these receivers in the water that allow us to detect the tags. So you can figure out where they go, for one, but the tags can also have sensors on them. So things like depth or temperature or accelerometers that measure like tail beats. So we've done things like temperature and depth profiles of what striped bass, what habitats they occupy. But more recently, we've been focusing on mortality, so discard mortality. And that's where we use those accelerometers, the measuring tail beats, to figure out what fish survive afterwards. And we're doing that now because we're sort of updating a study that was done at MassDMF 30 plus years ago that really answered that question. It was like, what percent of fish die afterwards? But that was pre-acoustic telemetry era. This is back when you would just catch fish and then you'd confine them for an amount of time and you just see how many fish die afterwards. And so we really can learn a lot better and understand what's going on more with this newer technology. And that's what we're doing.
And is that the often cited like 9% or 10% number?
Yes.
So that's a 30-year-old number there, but and you're currently updating that.
Yeah. So mid 1990s, a lot of the studies on what we call release mortality were, like I said, you catch fish, you stick it in a cage, you watch it, periodically pull the cage up for the next 2 or 3 days and see how many live. It's fine. You're directly observing these fish, but like they're not exposed to predators. They don't have prey. You're pretty stressed out if you were kept in prison for 3 days and you have no idea what's happened. So in the mid 1990s, we took a step beyond that and did something that was innovative at the time. We had this tidal impoundment in Salem, at our Cat Cove Marine Lab there, and we got 1,000 striped bass from they were actually caught in a fish weir in Rhode Island, put in a stocking truck, driven overland, and dumped in this tidal pool. And we then had fishing clubs come in and fish on them and record which of these fish were caught over the course of a summer. So every fish that got put in the pond had an individual tag. And, we record how they fished for them. And so at the end of the summer, we then had the ability to drain the pond because it had like a tidal gate on it. And then we could see which of those tagged fish remained. And any fish that we couldn't find, we assumed were eaten by scavengers. It doesn't take long for the crabs and lobsters to reduce it to a pile of bones. So that was the original study, but there's some reasons why this may not be all that representative. And for one, the average size fish that were caught in those fisheries was about 12 inches. That's a lot smaller than most of the fish that are released in our fishery. And we don't, there's lots of reasons why a fish might not be there when you drain the pond. An osprey could have gotten one. Could it be poachers in the neighborhood? Somebody's goes fishing at the local pond and catches them and takes it out. So, so we felt like we could do better. And that's what we're trying to do, is update that 9% value and add details to it. Like what is the rate? We are acknowledging now that it varies by different, environmental factors or fishing variables. And we're trying to uncover those details now.
So a modern study now with these acoustic tags, how do you go about, obviously these aren't fish caught in a fish weir. How is this study conducted and how do you put these tags into fish?
Our whole approach was to try to mimic the fishery as much as possible. Like, we recognized that wasn't very representative of recreational fishing experience, that original work. So we're using, typical recreational angling practices for New England, in Massachusetts. And so the original study of this acoustic telemetry of striped bass release mortality study was designed to answer one specific question, but also set us up to answer future questions. So the central question was, what is the conservation benefit that we are getting from requiring anglers to use circle hooks? So that there's that acknowledgement that that 9% varies. We think that we can actually reduce it by making anglers use a hook that results in higher survival. But we didn't know what that higher survival looked like, so we tried to estimate that. So we went out and we caught and tagged 350 striped bass with these electronic tags, split between different circle hook varieties and conventional J hooks, and let them go, and we can figure out what rate of them survived afterwards. What we found the biggest predictor of survival was this release condition score that we assigned each fish. So every fish, we would give it one of four values. It would be like a condition 1 is a fish totally uninjured, just like perfectly fine, swims away, no injuries. Condition 4 is basically a dead fish. It's belly up. It can't swim. And then the condition 3 fish is something that was like serious injury, like it swallowed the hook or it's bleeding and hooked in the gills. And everything else is condition 2, some minor amount of injury. So pretty unambiguous, easy to like assign. And this, it turns out, is the biggest predictor of what fish survive afterwards. So even though those 350 fish were done to evaluate bait fishing with hooks, we now have this really strong estimates of the survival for each of these condition scores. And that's what sets us up to explore all these other variables. Like most of the striped bass released, I think, are coming from artificial lures. And so that's where we trying to find some of these details. And now we're trying to get a large number of observations of these release conditions, so then we can make, ideas and predictions about what the survival rate is for those fish.
So kind of what you're saying there is that you found proof that you can kind of tell when you release a striped bass by looking at the condition of it. I think anyone who's caught a lot of striped bass has seen this. I've known sometimes I've caught fish, they took a hook in the gills, they're bleeding, they don't swim away very strong, and I think to myself, I don't think this fish is going to make it. You've been able to kind of look at that and say, yes, by looking at the condition of a fish when you let it go, you can pretty well predict if it's going to survive.
Yeah, like it's the strongest, there really is tell signs there, but by its condition when you're letting it go. But striped bass are a pretty hardy fish. Most fish survive. We come in with this with the expectation that like 90+% of the fish survive. Those ones, like the one you described there, that we assign that condition 3, more than half of those survive. It's about 44% mortality rate is what we estimated. So, and the fish that are completely fine, hooked in the corner of the mouth and swims away fine, it's like 1% mortality rate. So you can really, tell that like if there is sign of injury or, weakness, like that does really strongly affect their survival.
And so what is the next step now in this study? What questions are you still trying to answer?
So, the acoustic, it'd be great if we could just put these electronic tags in like all kinds of fish and just directly measure the mortality rate for like flies versus surface plugs versus different lure and hook combinations. But telemetry is an expensive business. These tags are like $600 a piece. Each receiver, which you need to have a ton out there to listen for them, is over $2,000 a piece. So we can't afford to do it that way. But now that we know what the mortality rate is for each of these condition scores, we can just go make a large number of observations of condition scores. And that's pretty inexpensive. It's just looking at the fish, where it's hooked, is it bleeding, and how weak is it when it swims away? And so now, and it's something that not just scientists can do, like general angling public can do it. And that's why we've created this citizen science project to sort of leverage the interested angling public to help us capture this information. So before 350, now we're like in many thousands of fish across all the different ways that people fish for them. So we can now have the ability to measure that difference in mortality rate between fish that are held out of the water for, longer than shorter, or larger fish versus smaller fish, or, double trebles versus single hooks, things like that.
And we had a podcast just a little over a year ago when the Citizen Science Project was launched, explaining the project and getting folks to sign up. But can you just give a quick overview of how does the Citizen Science Project work and how do people get involved?
So you just go to mass.gov/striper, and that sort of is the launch pad to like become engaged with it, to learn about it, and to sign up for it. And it's just all we ask is that people record some information when they go striped bass fishing. If you sign up, we'll mail you a sampling kit, so you'll get a stopwatch, a thermometer, and a tape measure, some data sheets and instructions, and it is a little bit of work. It's different than like when just going fishing and not recording all this information, because one of the things that we found can be really important for post-release mortality is like how long the fish are fought for and how long they are kept out of the water. So that's the stopwatch. And so when you hook a fish, we ask you start the stopwatch, and then when you get the fish in hand, you take a look at the time. And then when you actually release the fish out of the water, you take a look at the time again. And that takes some getting used to, juggling. I know you've done it, Kevin. You were one of our first anglers to sign up for the program. And but like once you get the hang of it, it becomes pretty simple. And then it's just recording like where the fish is hooked. It's like injury level, its ability to swim away, and then what you used, like basically your tackle configuration. And from that, we just collect it all, and it ends up in a central database. And it's been actually, you by far do a much better job at describing the project than I do, because you created, when you first signed up and you got your kit, you created this Instagram reel video, which, and when I go around and I talk to people about this project, and I just show your video clip, because you do a better job in like about 60 seconds describing what it's like to participate in this project than I can. But that's the magic of editing.
I need to sign up for my clip. If for no other reason, I'm curious how long I fight fish. In the retelling, it's always, they're 15-minute battles, but I think the reality is probably way short of that.
It typically is, yeah.
But it always feels like a little bit longer. So the longer fight time has a negative effect on the how well the fish survive.
Yeah, it does. We see that. That's one of the strongest signals is it's actually more so handling time than fight time. There's an effect of both, but the longer the fish is kept out of the water is really, that's like probably the biggest thing that we can all do, is to try to keep the fish, out of the water as short as possible. I mean, try holding your breath for 2 minutes. It's a lot to do, particularly after some predator has chased you and successfully caught you. And there's seems to be sort of like a threshold effect too, that beyond 2 minutes is really, they start to become much weaker when you let them go. 2
minutes is a long time.
That's longer than I would have thought. I mean, you should be able to get the fish unhooked and back in the water, unless it has deep hooked or hooked badly with maybe multiple treble hooks. But if that's the threshold, you think you could keep it under a minute.
And I think you can, but like you said, it's like, let's say you do gut hook it, and so you're presented with this choice as an angler. It's like, do I fiddle with this hook for a long time and try to like get it out? The injury's already done there. Like it's got a perforated gut, and you're sort of manhandling its gills and trying to get it out. Sometimes it's a judgment call, but sometimes it's better off cutting that line and getting the fish back in the water, and it's going to do better because of that.
It'll rust out. Is that kind of a myth, or does that actually, is that something we say to make ourselves feel better, or does cutting it, you said cutting it sometimes is potentially better for the fish.
I think it does. I don't have any sort of studies to point to say how long that takes. So I can't offer some direct evidence of that. This is a scientist talking here, but that I think it does. But a fish can live with these, like our tags that sometimes we'll surgically implant these tags. These tags will last for a decade, so we can observe these fish as long as they survive for many years, and they can survive with foreign objects in them for a while.
I will say, from participating in this study and using a stopwatch, like you mentioned, Jimmy, the fight times are shorter than they seem. When you're fighting a fish, it feels like an epic battle, but then you look at the watch and, okay, it really didn't take that long. Also, having the fish out of the water, it feels like you're getting that fish back in very quickly, and sometimes time passes faster. So it's kind of a good check on yourself to realize, hey, I'm taking longer to unhook this fish and get it back in the water than I realized it. And it puts you in a position now where I'm fishing, and even if I'm not collecting data and I don't have the stopwatch, there's more of a stopwatch in my head. Mm-hmm. So I would recommend every angler, when you have a striped bass on board, take your phone out, start a stopwatch, and just see how fast it takes, how long it takes for you to get that fish back in the water, and do everything you can to do it faster.
I had another question on releasing the fish. there's a lot of people talk about taking the time spent to make sure that it's got its strength back. What are some of the cues? If I'm releasing a good sized striped bass next to the boat or in the surf, before just instead of just tossing it in, how should I do that to give the fish the best chance of survival?
That's a good question, and I don't again have that's not something we've studied but certainly in place where there's significant predators around, seals, sharks, I think you can give that fish a leg up by offering it protection as it sort of recuperates. Because I think that if you release that fish and you can see them sometimes when they swim away slowly, particularly if the water temperature is really warm, that they are probably much more susceptible to being eaten.
Now that is a situation where I don't really want to be hanging on to a fish for too long if there's sharks
Your
around.
fingers in the water, yeah.
But no, so that's a situation where you can't give it a leg up by holding it. I mean, the cues I've always been told to look for: look for the dorsal fin to go until he's trying to swim out of your hand, and
Yep.
and actually actively biting down on your thumb if you're holding the thumb in its mouth. So.
Yep.
So before we jump into the results that you've gotten so far from this citizen science project, let's go over some of these things just so that so we're all on the kind of the same page. Some of the scientifically supported things that we know can help improve striped bass release mortality, make the fish more likely to survive. What are some of the things that we can recommend that anglers do to help striped bass survive being caught?
So there's tackle, choices you can make. We see that live dead baits definitely lead to higher mortality rates than artificial lures. But there's complexity there. There's an asterisk because there are certain types of artificial lures that actually can yield the same level of mortality as live baits. And so it's this sort of is logical, but the more hooks and the more hook points on your lure, the more likely that a fish is going to sustain injury. But it's not just sort of like 1-for-1 increase. It's having that double hook, I think, really ups the possibility of being hooked, either foul hooked on the outside. Once you get one in the mouth and that other hook is swinging around, it can either get you in the eye or on the outside. But if it's inside the mouth, it can hook you in the gill. And being hooked in the gill is probably the worst place. That's so many blood vessels there, and it can start to bleed. So number of hooks. We already talked about handling time, water temperature.
So warmer water temperatures have a big effect on mortality, or have an effect on mortality?
You know what is interesting with this is that most of the water temperature we have in Massachusetts is there's no effect really. The fish are completely fine, but you get to the warmest temperature of the year, the seasonal maximum, it's about 75 degrees. Then you see all of a sudden this big jump in what we think the mortality rate is. As you see one of the things we ask our citizen scientists to record is when the fish swims away, is it swimming away normally? Is it weak? Or can it not swim at all? So it's just 3 levels. Basically, is it fine? Is it dead? Or is it shows some sort of weakness? And under almost all the water temperatures we have around here, it's less than 5% any impact at all. But you get above 75 degrees and it's 15% of the bass are really showing signs of weakness. So I think you can really help by minimizing your handling time during those warmest water temperatures. Maybe skip the picture on that day and just get it right back in the water, or don't even take it out of the water.
And 75 degrees is pretty warm. That's tough to find in Massachusetts, except like you said, it's kind of the peak of summer maybe in some inshore areas. In shallow estuaries and harbors.
More likely to find that from Connecticut, Long Island South, where there are resident stripers that live through the summer. Even I know people in Raritan Bay who catch big bass right through August, and that's when you are encountering those high temperatures.
And I've seen recommendations for the Chesapeake Bay fishery for on certain days when the water temperature is very high. Managers down there recommending, hey, it might not be the best time to target striped bass. Consider not fishing for them because the water temperature is too high. Similar to what in freshwater, a lot of trout fishermen don't target trout during
they call
peak
them
summer temperatures.
The hoot owl regulations on some of the trout rivers out west, where target them between midnight and 10 a.m. I think.
The people at Z-Man Fishing have been dedicated to ignoring the book on traditional lure making, instead setting out to create truly category-defining lures, soft baits, and jig systems that simply catch fish. At Z-Man, authentic innovation remains a badge of honor, recognized and admired by countless fans worldwide. I'm one of those fans. I've fished countless Z-Man products in both fresh and salt, from their chatterbaits to their soft plastics made from a material they call Elastec. Some of the most naturally acting, durable soft baits I've ever fished. I've caught PBs on their smallest baits, like on a massive brown trout, choked a micro finesse TRD while targeting smallies, to hooking giant tarpon and redfish on their diesel minnows, which are also phenomenal striper baits. The best part is, when bluefish show up, they'll hold up to them too. Give them a look at zmanfishing.com or ask for them at your local shop.
I mean, it makes sense too. It's like these fish evolved to spend their summers up here where the water temperature is sort of suitable to them. And when you get to the fringe of that, then they, it's outside of what their body can handle.
So the Citizen Science Project last year was the first year, 2023, kind of the rollout. This year, 2024, you've had a lot more participants, and you've started to put the data out there kind of as it's come in, and it's available to the public. There's a data portal online that people can go to and see what the results are as they come in. Can you summarize some of the things that you've seen so far and that you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I want to give them a plug for this idea of letting the public in on and the participants in on the data as it's coming. And that's sort of like not typically done in science projects. It's sort of like collect all the information and we play with it for a long time and then give what we find afterwards. And I've done a lot of cooperative research over the years with commercial fishery, recreational fishery, and one of the biggest sort of feedbacks we get is that we participated, but we never found out what happened with what we worked on. What came of all that? We know, and the scientists, we trying to use the information to affect change to help them, but I think the public wants to know what's going on with it. So we're trying to make good on our end there and provide access to see these patterns unfold as we're collecting. And we don't have answers for all of the explanations for what we're seeing, but you can see it as it comes in. So you can get to there off our mass.gov/striper page. And we see, it's really interesting to see because we have anglers from every Atlantic coast state. We've got anglers from Washington State, Illinois, Vermont, inland states that come and spend time in the summer here. We have almost 1,000 anglers have signed up, and I think we're up almost 7,000 bass have been reported to the program. Consider when we, as biologists, went out and tried to collect these fish and record these kinds of observations. We spent 2 summers of our staff members and bringing out guest anglers, and we caught 700 bass, which is a lot. It was a lot of work. I mean, really hard work to go fishing, but it was a lot of fun too. But that just shows you what's possible with participation of the public, that we can get 10 times that amount. And because striped bass are pretty hardy, and that you have typically less than 10% of the fish die afterwards, you need those big numbers to be able to see a difference between these different things. Because if in 100 fish, only 10 of them or less might likely die, how can you split the difference and say it's more likely to happen because we're using double trebles compared to all the other different things?
Now, is there a concern that maybe the sampling size on that end are people who are more active, more paying attention to striped bass conservation? So you may not get the less experienced fisherman that is gut hooking a fish and dragging it onto the sand and letting it languish there for more than 2 minutes. So is there any, do you factor in for that at all?
That's a really good and important question, because that's the last phase of this whole idea, this whole project to update our estimate of release mortality for striped bass. Is we acknowledge that this is the people that would be motivated to participate in this program may not be representative of the average angler up and down the coast. We do collect information on their experience and their avidity, how often they go. And we see that there is an effect there. It's more likely if you've never been fishing before, you have, have longer handling times and higher expected mortality rate, just because there's a learning curve to be able to figure out how to take a fish off the hook. But once you gain some, minimal amount of experience, then you sort of like, you all are capable of doing well. But the last phase of what we need to do now is sort of survey the entire fishery, recreational fishery, and ask them these sorts of questions of like, what types of lures do you typically use? Do you go bait fishing? Do you release more of your fish via, flies or surface lures? And from that, we can then sort of connect all of the pieces of this study, from the first part with the acoustic telemetry to this citizen science where we identify what variables are important, to then connect it to a description of those variables for the whole fishery. And that will be happening over the next year with surveys to the entire coastwide fishery.
So that will capture then kind of the entire public and give us really a better picture of how striped bass are being caught, with what methods, and and kind of put some quantities to that. And so we know how many people are fly fishing versus plug fishing, how many hooks they're using, how many bait fishermen there are. And then that'll kind of give us a better picture. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get a better single estimate. Right now it's that 9% value, which gets used in the stock assessment. We'll probably still be using a single estimate in the stock assessment, at least initially, but we'll have a better, more defensible number. But it gives us so much more opportunity for fishery management to understand, where the largest source of mortality is coming from. And so that's what we need, is information. We need to arm ourselves with information to be able to improve things.
And if that number is less than 9%, that's good news, I
Sure.
would think.
Yeah.
It will allow us to manage better. And then it also gives us an opportunity to say, how can we improve on that? Right? And we've talked about some methods that fishermen can use and what they can do. And if we can get that number down, the difference between 9%, 8%, 7%, when you're talking about how many striped bass are caught and released, it's a huge number of fish and it can really kind of change the way striped bass are managed.
Yeah, it really is, because it's the largest source of removals from the population is this recreational release mortality. And that's a big part of that math, is this 9% value. So like, if we can get that more accurate, that will change that sort of like pie chart of like where the removals are coming from. It'll still probably be the majority of human caused mortality. But I think that we will, it'll be pretty eye-opening once we finally get to the end of it, and find out what the actual value might be.
And it's a really important point that I just want to repeat. And I think recreational fishermen, catch and release fishermen, have started to understand this. But there's always been a lot of finger pointing. I still hear from a lot of anglers that say, I'm a catch and release striper fisherman. I'm not part of the problem. I don't kill fish. It's folks who keep fish, and it's the commercial fishery. When really the truth is, far and away, we all play a role. We're all responsible. And even if you are a catch and release fisherman, you're part of the greatest source of mortality of striped bass right now. More striped bass are removed from the population because they are released and don't survive. And so you really are, it's not enough to just be a catch and release fisherman. You have to be a responsible one as well, and realize there's things you can do to help more of those fish survive.
And that's a tough pill to swallow, because you do kind of, as somebody, if you don't keep striped bass, you kind of feel like you're on your high horse a little bit compared to some of the other removals in the fishery. And but accepting that you too have an impact on the number of striped bass in the population is, like you said, could help influence how you catch and release your stripers and then improve the fishery. So.
And I think we'll see, and we already have seen it begin in kind of the tackle industry. Folks who make lures targeting striped bass are hearing this information and understanding it, realizing that folks want to be able to make sure that they can catch and release striped bass. More companies are producing inline single hooks for plugs, so that you can take plugs that normally used to have 2-3 treble hooks on them, replace it with an inline single hook. Again, that can help improve catch and release mortality. We're seeing also plug makers create what they call flags for the back of a plug. So instead of a hook on the back of the plug, you have a bucktail or billet.
It's just a dressed.
This.
It's just a kind of a piece of wire that's dressed with either bucktail or feathers or something like that, and that helps. Because just removing all your treble hooks or all your hooks from a plug it's not quite that simple. I mean, people have been designing plugs to be fished with treble hooks for, since Bob Pond in the 1940s for striped bass. And there's a certain amount of drag that's created that makes these plugs and these designs swim a certain way. When you put an inline single hook on it, it does change the action of some of the plugs. And putting a flag on the back that's dressed creates some more drag, also some added attraction, makes the lure look a little bit bigger. But there's a bit of a learning curve knowing what size inline single to go with. And then one of the, I've seen some of the results saying that 2 treble hooks are bad, treble hook and a single hook are bad, 2 single hooks are better, 1 single hook's best, but 1 treble hook is better than 2 single hooks. Is that right?
That's like we haven't teased apart those like level of detail yet, because we saw one pattern in the first year, and we're seeing a similar pattern in the second year of our citizen science, but it's not clear yet what are the ultimate drivers. But yes, it's single hooks are definitely the least. Double trebles are the worst. I think if you look across all our data set right now, we would go single treble, and then the double hooks. So double singles, single treble, and double treble. That's like the ranking of most amount of injury that you would expect.
And so there is, like we've been describing, kind of some judgment calls. I mean, no hooks is the best, but that's not a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I haven't achieved that level of zen yet.
We still want to catch fish. And so kind of looking at that judgment of with specific plugs, when do you have that opportunity to remove the number of hooks or to decrease the number of hooks on there? And when, what plugs are there that are going to fish best with, say, 2 single hooks or a treble and a flag on the back? And just kind of making that call. But the more recreational fishermen who are thinking about that kind of thing, who are thinking again about their tackle, about their fight time, about how long they have the fish out of the water, the more of us that are thinking along those lines, that have that stopwatch in our head, the better we can reduce that percentage of fish that don't survive being caught and released, and it's better for the fishery.
Even in bait fishing, there seems to be a range of levels of injury with different types of bait. We see that things that are more easily swallowed, like eels and even mackerel, are more result in higher mortality rates and injury compared to like live menhaden. As live menhaden, it's sort of hard to swallow that entirely. So there's choices to be made even if you aren't a plug fisherman.
Yeah, I can imagine clams and seaworms too go down the hatch pretty easily, even with circle hooks.
We don't have as many observations of those, but it seems like most bait fishermen are live mackerel fishermen that we've seen in our 7,000 bass reported. Like, we have quite a bit of information now, and it's live mackerel are by far the most popular bait.
Wow.
That's used. Yeah.
So this isn't going to be in there. You said you did some work with Atlantic herring too? Would you be able to talk about how they're doing now or what's happening with them?
Sure, to some extent, yeah.
I'm just curious, just because we put up a clip on Instagram today about the shifting diet in bluefin tuna. Dr. Walt Gillette from up in Maine is studying bluefin tuna stomach contents, and he said that he's seen a shift over the last 8 years where it was predominantly Atlantic herring, and now it's predominantly menhaden. And if that mirrored kind of what you're seeing in terms of the Atlantic herring population.
Yeah, it totally is a connected story. I mean, bluefin tuna, like striped bass, could be opportunistic feeders, and they'll feed on what abundant forage species are available to them. The Atlantic herring population is actually a fairly similar sort of story to striped bass, in that what's happening there is that we've had several years of poor year classes in a row. And so went from a really high population, a lot of what we call spawning stock, to coming down. And the herring population has come down to a pretty low point. And so the herring that bluefin tuna used to eat simply aren't there in the numbers that they used to be. But we've had the very strong menhaden population. And more importantly, the menhaden population has like what we call a deeper age structure. There's more older menhaden now than there have been in the past. And menhaden make this annual migration up the coast. We all see them as bass fishermen. But what's really interesting about menhaden is that the oldest, largest menhaden go farther north. So when you have this deep age structure, older menhaden, you're more likely to get them north of Cape Cod. Up where Walt is doing diet studies and off the coast of Maine, it's in the Gulf of Maine, north of Cape Cod, menhaden are periodically available. There could be 20 years where there's no menhaden up there. And then there could be 30 years where menhaden are just stupid abundant everywhere. We happen to be in a phase where they are quite abundant. And bluefin tuna are taking advantage of that.
I didn't know the connection between the age of the menhaden and how far they migrated.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
It was one of the largest mark and recapture studies ever conducted on fish. It was over 1 million menhaden were tagged, and over 100,000 were recaptured in the 1960s, early 1970s. And so we actually have this great set of information on like menhaden movements, seasonally, spatially, by age. And so and you can see it's what happens is we get much larger and older menhaden off of Massachusetts than you get off of New Jersey.
It's also interesting to see how much that varies year to year. We were talking before we started recording about how 2 years ago in Massachusetts we had huge numbers of menhaden right in Massachusetts Bay off of Plymouth. You had the whales, striped bass, this big fishery happening. Last year, it seemed like the menhaden just passed through and all went up to further north up into Canadian waters. Locally, a lot of fishermen were saying, "Oh, the population's crashed. We've caught too many menhaden. The commercial fishermen caught too many." A lot of finger pointing. But when you zoom way out and realize they're all still there, they just for some reason last year, and I don't know if anybody knows why, they all swam further north. This year, they seem to be around more, especially right now in Massachusetts Bay off Boston Harbor in that area.
Yeah, that's definitely there's availability to the local anglers, and then there's the population trajectory. The population is still quite high, and they just for whatever reason, and I don't have an answer for that. Why last year they seemed to like pass right through Massachusetts to like further north. But yeah, I saw the same. Your story rings true with what I've seen in the past 3 years as well.
Do menhaden spawn in Massachusetts waters? I know we get the juveniles, the peanut bunker. We
Yeah.
see them every fall, but
You can only get peanut bunker from local spawning. So
Okay.
the fact that we get peanut bunker is proof of these local spawning. And it used to be considered like a footnote on the menhaden population that we have reproduction up here. It was sort of conventional wisdom that the bulk of the population spawns in the winter off of North Carolina, Virginia, the coastal shelf. And what happens is like they spawn offshore and their larvae sort of drift into like estuaries, and the biggest estuary in the Atlantic coast is the Chesapeake, and that was always considered that's the engine that pumps out menhaden. But what you see is that, and we see this in power plants, like they have to pull in cooling water, and they're required by permits to have like these, they call them impingement screens, where they scrape it off and you actually count and categorize what kinds of eggs and fish larvae are on there. So and they've been doing this for 50, 60 years. So we have all these records of menhaden eggs when they show up and where they show up. So we see this in May and June, Cape Cod Bay, Buzzards Bay, Narragansett Bay, May and June. Into July, we see menhaden eggs and larvae, which is totally different than spawning off the coastal shelf off of North Carolina. And those eggs turn into larvae, and then they turn into peanut bunker. And it seems to be that the peanut bunker are, a little bit earlier further south and a little bit later further north. Like I live in Gloucester, when we see them, it's typically September into October.
we're just starting to see them now. Here,
Right.
as we record this, it's early August, and they're just starting to notice them. Right now, they're still pretty small, and then by the time it gets to October, they'll be considerably larger. So.
And maybe an obvious point here, but I didn't know that before, that they spawn locally, and that's where I always thought that, it was sort of a more regionally thing. So last year, when we didn't have a lot of menhaden, like I mentioned in Massachusetts, we didn't see a lot of peanut bunker in the fall. So now thinking about it, like that's obvious. So
there's
that's
a connection
why we saw
there.
that. Yeah, and hopefully this year we'll see more, because I know the local fish, stripers, bluefish, albies, they're a lot easier to catch, it seems, when they're eating peanut bunker versus last year when they were eating a lot of small bait.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. If I could just ask one more question about Atlantic herring. Sure. You mentioned it was kind of the conditional, the spawning has been in a little bit of a low spot. Do you know what kind of ocean conditions we need for productive Atlantic herring spawning? And is there any indication that maybe we'll see it in the next couple of years or this year?
Maybe. So right now we're going through a Atlantic herring major stock assessment. And so this is where these sorts of questions, like that's the biggest question in the Atlantic herring stock, is like, why do we have poor year classes? And it may not be that we don't have enough spawning, because we had a really big spawning stock, 10 years ago. And it's just every year we weren't getting any young fish. They would show up, as 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds. And it might be just the survival of those young fish. And so we have a hypothesis, and I'm sort of exploring that. And I think might be linked to the haddock population. So over the same time you've seen that the herring population sort of crater, you've seen the haddock population skyrocket, like orders of magnitude bigger, more haddock that have been around than ever recorded. And these haddock are basically starving. There's so many of them, they're sort of stunted. Like there used to be, an 8-year-old haddock would be like 5 kilograms or something like that. When there were this huge boom, an 8-year-old haddock would be like 1 kilogram. Pardon the metric units, but this is science. This is how we keep track of these things. But you can see the difference there. These things are basically, so you've got a fish that eats stuff on the seafloor. It specializes in benthic, like seafloor things that don't move. And it's starving, and there's a bazillion of them out there. Now, herring, when they spawn, they lay eggs that sink into these big sticky mats that create like a carpet. It's just basically a carpet of protein laid out before this like hungry haddock population. And I think that there's a strong possibility that like those egg mats were gobbled up for years. And so we've had just really poor survival of that reproduction. Now that the haddock population is coming down. It is like we had so many strong year classes in a row, and haddock is one of these species that goes through these massive booms and busts. And it was like an epic boom, but is now coming off that. I wouldn't say that the population is low, but it's coming off of that really high. And so maybe that can provide some space for the herring population to, regrow. But we've got, we're in this pit now. The population has been brought so low. Stocks sort of operate funny when they're in this low space. They don't bounce back quickly. So we've got to work our way out of this pit, unfortunately.
That's really, I would never think that haddock were impacting the Atlantic herring population. And part of the reason I also ask, obviously it's important to bluefin tuna, but Atlantic herring have this tendency, you talk of them almost mythically in striper fishing, where they are the fish that pull in. You want a shot at a 50-pounder in mid-November, it's going to be because the herring came in, and they give you your last shot at one big fish. And fishermen, surf guys talk about that kind of reverently, back years ago, maybe this will be a big herring year. Montauk, it happens on the Cape, but it's been a while. Last one was after Hurricane Sandy. A bunch of them blew in after that into the canal and created some great November fishing. But anyhow, thank you. That was
Yeah, it's really in these conversations we've had through having guests on the podcast, and every time we talk about fishery management, I'm always struck by how from the outside, we always want to think of it in terms of let's manage our fisheries so that every single species is abundant and every prey species is abundant, and we've got an ocean full of all the fish we want and we can walk on them. We tend to remember looking backwards like the best year for certain species, and we want that to be consistent. And the truth is, it seems like so many, there's all these relationships, like you mentioned, with potentially haddock and sea herring. There's so many of those in fish populations, and there's so many fish populations that are built to, or they seem to be adapted to this boom and bust cycle. And so I don't really have a more of just an observation of it's fascinating to listen to and to think about. And on top of that, you've got the ocean where fish can move, and from year to year, especially when we talk about fish species that are more pelagic, we've talked about about tuna. The menhaden be able to cover big distances. In any given year, it's kind of just this crapshoot of what the ocean conditions are, where the fish move. And then finally, on top of all of that, we have this sort of long-term change going on in our ocean, which is a very real thing, the fact that the Gulf of Maine is consistently getting warmer. And so how is that affecting some of these fish populations as well?
You've just described why it's very difficult to do like what it is that we do in trying to assess stocks and set rules and limits of how much is too much, for the population to be sustainable. It's a really challenging thing to do because of all these ecological connections, environmental change. But we're sort of entering into this new era where I think we're being more realistic about acknowledging those things. So for striped bass and menhaden, that we now manage those two fisheries with this like acknowledged connection between them. We have an ecosystem-based reference point. That's just as it means we're setting the limits for menhaden fishing while also trying to maximize like the striped bass population. That's not really done in a lot of places to try to connect different populations together. And we do that through this big mathematical model where we've got not just those two, but we've got all the other prey species that striped bass might eat are tried to be accounted for in there, and all the other predators that might eat those prey species, because it's all connected. And so we're going through that process of updating that now too, and we're doing things like trying to incorporate bluefin tuna, which haven't been considered before in this, but now because of things like when Golet's talking about this switch over and eating more menhaden, that's we need to acknowledge that and account for that new predation in these sorts of models. But all those things are connected in there. We have things like groundfish species like cod and haddock in that model because you wouldn't think about it, but it's connected to these other species.
So you mentioned 10-year-old you would be pretty amazed to see that this is what you get to do for a living. I was wondering if you could give any advice to, I'm sure we have some younger people listening who might be considering a career and getting into some realm of fishery science or management, or, parents of someone of a young person who's thinking along those lines. Any advice on how to get into this position that you're in now of this type of career?
I mean, I didn't even discover it was an option until I was the end of my undergraduate college degree. My parents, they owned an environmental consulting company. So, I had sort of an environmental bent, but they were cleaning up hazardous waste from leaky underground storage tanks at gas stations. And I worked for them for a summer, and I decided this wasn't a very fun job. But that's what in college, for lack of anything better to do, I was taking classes in hazardous waste remediation. And I was like, this sucks. And then I realized there was this whole department that was studying fish and wildlife, and that I could become a fish biologist. So my last semester, I started taking these classes this is for me. And so I then got internships. And I think that's, if you're a high school or college kid who's thinking about this, internships are a terrific way to try something out, to see whether it fits you, and also demonstrate that you can do some meaningful work. So I tried some internships that were terrible. I worked for IBM for a summer in their hazardous waste stream managing, and I was in a building that was I was a mile walk from a window. And it was just that was my summer. And I was this is not for me. And then I went to get an internship at Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and then at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I got to be outside all summer, and I was electrofishing all kinds of fish from streams and ponds. And I was this is just about as fun as it gets. So I think if you enjoy being outside, you like to think. That's an important part. If you want to be a scientist, you have to like to think. And then, internships are a great way to give you experience, but try it out, see if it's a good fit for you.
Awesome. That's great advice.
I have one last thing. My introduction to you was your plug.
Oh,
the Micah Dean sand deal.
My side hustle.
Exactly. Yeah. So we were, Kevin and I were fishing. Man, this had to be 15 years ago.
Yeah.
We were up on the North Shore fishing with Brian O'Connor, and he I think everybody we encountered that day was fishing your plug, which is kind of a needlefish, the sand eel. And then he took us to the shop and showed us like, oh, you have to get this plug. I think I still have mine somewhere. But yeah, that was it was the plug to have. Then I'm sure they're still in rotation for a lot of surf casters.
Was telling Micah that we were a little kind of dubious. We didn't really believe in the plug when we first saw it because
it's fair. That's fair.
You want to describe what the plug looks like?
It's a stick.
It's a stick, and
it's a nicely painted stick.
And we went up there, and everybody swore by it, and we said, "Okay, this is just a stick. I'm not buying it." But up on those beaches, we were fishing Crane's Neck, Crane's Beach, and shallow, sandy fish were chasing sand eels in there, and that kind of a shallow floating stick lure. If the folks who knew how to use it, they were doing really well.
That was what kind of opened my eyes to the productivity of needlefish. Like that was what I mean. But right now, by far and away, needlefish are my favorite lure. And I didn't quite get it until I saw Brian O'Connor and the guys up there catching on that. And I thought, man, like this. Okay, all right, I gotta put more time into this. But that was
yeah. I'm sure there's some people who were listening to this podcast and heard the name Micah Dean and said, "Wait a minute, that's the guy who used to make plugs." Are you thinking about getting back into turning plugs, or just too busy right now?
Yeah, I'm pretty busy, family life and work life. But my kids, I tried to enlist them to help me make some. So we started making a batch over the winter. So maybe I'll be making some more. Not a lot, not like I used to. I think I sold like over 1,000 in the first few years that I did it. But I didn't have any kids at the time, and I felt like I had more free time to dispose. But you were talking about like lure hook placement on lures, and like it affects the way it fished. Like that's the sort of things that I really discovered. And like Brian O'Connor was like a constant customer, and he'd bring it back. He's like, nope, lure needs to be back or forward a little bit more.
He's not shy about feedback.
No, he would tell you feedback, he'd give it to you. But like that, like those things, you see a difference when you change things out. Like, and so like that lure fished partly because of like figuring it out. Like, what is the right balance in hook placement and weight and diameter and things like that. But yeah, the biggest bass I ever caught was on my own lure. And that's like still like one of the coolest experiences. It's like just catching the first fish on like my own lure was like some of my first lures were ridiculous looking. You just like, I'm going to try this. And they didn't work at all. And then like when you finally catch something on something you made, you're like, that was awesome. And then when you start to like, okay, this thing actually works better than other things. And then, yeah, I caught it like in one of our studies when we're tagging bass with acoustic transmitters. I caught like a 48-inch bass on one of my sand eels, and I was like, yeah, it's still a great photo.
So not only on one of your plugs, but while you were doing
right. It was a good day, like I said, right?
That's pretty awesome. I couldn't let the podcast go by without bringing it up though. So it's awesome. Everglades Boats is an industry leader in premium offshore fishing boats. Founded in 1997 by boating industry legend and former Boston Whaler executive Bob Doherty, Everglades revolutionized the boat building industry with the invention of the ram cap process for one-piece unsinkable hulls. Respected for its renowned hull ride, Everglades builds center console and hybrid boats from 25 to 45 feet that make a statement about the status and savvy of their owner. Everglades has received numerous industry awards and achieved an unparalleled reputation for superior safety, performance, and quality. For more information about Everglades Boats, stop by your local dealer or visit evergladesboats.com. Everglades Boats, built for beyond.
And I just, I want people to be still aware. People can still sign up. We have lots of sampling kits left. If anyone wants to participate, it's going to go through to December to try to capture like fish as they move down the coast. Anyone along the coast is welcome to join the program. And we give away lots of raffle prizes. We give away pen spinning combos, 3 a month. Lots of like Costa hats and local tackle manufacturers have kicked in gear, hoagie lures, 24/7 lures, Algags lures are all in this prize packs. And it's one of the funnest things I get to do is like call people up and say like, hey, I'm giving you a bunch of free stuff. Thanks for participating.
I remember when this was first coming together, being asked, hey, for some advice based on how the Striper Cup is run and how we give away prizes, how can we use this? And so to see that kind of build off what we do with the Striper Cup, this idea of giving away prizes to people for participating, and seeing the support from, like you mentioned, Penn reels, these giant international brands, all the way down to local manufacturers like Algags and Hoagie Lures supporting this work is so important. Another thing that you mentioned was there's expense in all of this. There's a cost to it. The acoustic tags you mentioned that you did this research on are very expensive. Can you explain a little bit about where does the money come from? How is all this important work paid for?
Oh, good. I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's important to recognize that a lot of this work was funded by the license fees. When you become a Massachusetts saltwater angler, you pay your $10. This is an example of what that $10 gets you, is that we're trying to improve the conditions in the fisheries that people care about by conducting meaningful research. And this is for the past 4 or 5 years, this has been a big part of that.
$10 is a steal when you look at it for something like that,
honestly.
especially compared to, you go inland to some of the freshwater fisheries and their licenses, you're paying $50,
Right.
But $10 for that to help, maintain and improve our saltwater fisheries is, it makes it happy to buy it. I buy mine every year on January 1st. So,
And it's nice to see that it goes somewhere, like you pay that $50, like you're not exactly sure what it's funding, but the way that it's structured, maybe because this was a license that came about much later, was sort of like there's this need to demonstrate, like, what are you doing with that money? So public access and research is really what you're getting for it.
Awesome. I think that's a great note to end it on. Mike, I really want to thank you for coming down and talking to us. You mentioned that there is still, folks can still sign up for the Citizen Science Project.
Yep.
Right? And what's the website again?
It's mass.gov/striper. And we also have a smartphone app partner that makes it real easy to do this. You don't have to use pencil and paper. Got one. You can get to that from our website as well. So, yeah. Please, if you have any interest in participating and joining it, winning prizes, it's a lot of fun.
We will share those links. And once again, it is not only for striped bass fishermen fishing in Massachusetts. You're looking for information up and down the coast.
And we're particularly looking for anglers up and down the coast. We have a lot of Massachusetts anglers, but we're really interested in seeing what happens in those warmer water temperatures further south and later in the year when the bass continue their migration back to their spawning rivers.
So if you're a New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island striper fisherman, we encourage you to go sign up and be part of this Citizen Science Project. And I think one of the things we've touched on today, no matter where you fish for striped bass, if you're a catch and release angler, there's a lot you can do to make sure that your striped bass swim off healthier, and it'll help improve the striped bass population. Great. Thank you very much, Micah.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.